The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. We hope that you find today's lesson, presented by our minister, Dr. Joseph Becker, informative, insightful, and inspirational.
Usually when we talk about tossing a coin, that we think of as an event that gives us even odds. That is, if you flip a quarter, most of us would agree that if you call it in the air, calling it either heads or tails, the odds that you will be correct are 1 in 2, or about 50-50. However, it's not entirely true because flipping a quarter is a physical event that's subject to many, many variables. And if we could account for those variables and control them, we could change the odds of a tossed coin significantly. For instance, will you start with the coin heads up or heads down? How much force will you apply to the quarter with your thumb? At what angle will that force be applied? How much resistance will the quarter meet as it flies through the air? Will you catch it or let it fall to the ground? And if you catch it, when you catch it, will you call it as it lands in your hand, or will you flip it over and place it on the opposing arm? And all these variables will be further influenced by factors such as the length of your thumb, the strength of your thumb. Did you trim your nails this morning? Have you used lotion today? Is the quarter a recent issue quarter, or was it issued before 1964? And what is the temperature, humidity, and density of the air? And I could list more variables, if time permitted, but the point is every one of these variables will affect the outcome of that coin toss. And if you could account for all the variables and control for them, you could change the odds of a coin toss significantly. As a matter of fact, if you could control all the variables and build some kind of coin tossing machine that operated in a vacuum under completely predictable circumstances, you could conceivably cause a tossed coin to come up heads 100% of the time. However, such an undertaking would be a colossal waste of time and would be very difficult to achieve, because the sheer number of variables, even in an event as seemingly simple and straightforward as tossing a coin, is phenomenally high, because life is unimaginably complex. And there's no way for any of us to account for all the variables. I used to watch a show called Mythbusters. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And on that show, the two principal Mythbusters, Adam Savage and Jamie Hyneman, attempted to determine the plausibility of certain events associated with certain myths by recreating the circumstances under which those events are purported to have happened. And they tried to do that just as scientifically as they could. That is, they accounted for as many of the variables that they could, and they tried to set up controlled circumstances under which they could establish a baseline or a control sample against which to measure all the other results they got in the course of their experimentation. The thing is that very often establishing that baseline, even in a controlled experiment, proved to be very difficult, because the variables are extremely difficult to control, and very often in the course of trying to establish the baseline, they discovered that there were other variables that they hadn't anticipated that were affecting the result. Life is complex. Now, it's not random, but it is very complex. And even in the most delimited of arenas, it's beyond our power, beyond our ability to account for all the variables, much less to control the variables. And most of us are very poor at calculating the likelihood of a given event occurring because our intuition often runs counter to reality. For example, I'm sure you're all familiar with, or perhaps you've heard of, the Monty Hall problem. Off and on from 1963 to 1991, more on than off, the game show Let's Make a Deal, hosted by Monty Hall, aired daily. And for the last 10 years, it's been running with Wayne Brady as its host. And at the end of every show, the finalists are presented with the opportunity to give up the prizes that they've already won and exchange them for the big deal, or a chance at the big deal. And in the big deal, the contestant is presented with 3 doors, behind only one of which is the grand prize, while the other 2 doors conceal much lesser prizes, at least one of which could always be a total bust. a zonk. And the contestant has to choose door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3. Now, on that first choice, the odds of picking the grand prize are 1 in 3, 33%. But after the contestant has made his or her choice, the host then reveals what's behind one of the other 2 doors. Now, the door that would be revealed was never the door concealing the prize, or the grand prize. It was always a zonk, or a lesser prize. And once it was revealed, only 2 doors remained, and the contestant knew that the door they had already selected was either the grand prize or a lesser prize. But, and here's the tricky part, they're then given the option of sticking with the door that they have already chosen or switching to the other door. Now, intuition would tell you that once the third door is eliminated and only 2 doors remain, then the odds of choosing the right door should have changed from 1 in 3 to 1 in 2, from 33% to 50%, the same as that of tossing a coin. So it shouldn't make any difference whether the contestant stays or switches. But from the beginning of the show, the producers began to notice that that wasn't so. Because when contestants were given the opportunity to switch doors, it turns out that those who switched, on average, won the grand prize much more often than did those who stuck with their original choice. And this puzzled them. So they presented the problem to mathematicians at the journal The American Statistician, who first formally addressed the question in Volume 29, Issue 3 of August 1975, but did not come up with a satisfying solution to the question. It wasn't until 1990, when Marilyn Vos Savant took up the question, that the problem was solved mathematically. And the solution is surprisingly simple, because the solution set intuition aside and sticks strictly to the math. In short, when a contestant is first presented with the 3 doors, the chances of picking the right door are 1 in 3, and the contestant's choice is probably wrong. After the contents of one of the doors is revealed, our intuition tells us that the equation has changed and that the choice is now 50-50. But that isn't right, because the revelation of the one door doesn't actually remove it from the equation. The knowledge of what's behind that one door is a red herring. We think it removes that door from consideration, but that's because we're greedy and we're motivated to attempt to go for the grand prize. But the math isn't greedy. The numbers are not subject to motivation. And as far as the math is concerned, knowledge of what's behind one of the doors doesn't change the equation. Well, I should say it does change the equation, but in a counterintuitive way. Because the third door isn't actually removed from the equation. The contestant knows that that option isn't the grand prize, but the math doesn't know that. As far as the math is concerned, there's still a 33% chance that the revealed door is the grand prize. According to the math, there are still 3 doors. The odds of picking the right door are still 1 in 3, and the contestant's original choice is still probably wrong. So those who stick to their original choice still have a 1 in 3 chance of getting it right and will win a third of the time. But those who switch to the other remaining door have a 2 in 3 chance of getting it right and will win 2/3 of the time. However, even though you've now heard the answer to the question, your intuition probably tells you that that's not right, that can't possibly be correct, and you're not alone. A lot of people doubted Marilyn Vos Savant's solution to this problem. After the problem appeared in Parade magazine, approximately 10,000 readers, including nearly 1,000 with PhDs, wrote to the magazine insisting that Vos Savant had to be wrong. Even when given explanations, simulations, and formal mathematical proofs, many people still could not accept that switching is the best strategy. Indeed, Paul Erdos, one of the most prolific mathematicians in history, remained unconvinced of this proof for 9 years until 1999, when he was shown a computer simulation confirming the predicted result. That's how strongly we tend to believe in the accuracy of our intuition, and how easily we can be misled by our intuition, we suspect that the additional information is helpful to us, but we often misintuit what that information tells us. And people who know that use that knowledge against us. For instance, you're all probably familiar with the Allstate commercials featuring spokesman Dennis Haysbert, in which he sits calmly in an easy chair while stunt drivers whiz all around him doing one thing and another. And in his calm and sonorous delivery, he articulates one benefit of Allstate insurance after another. And then, at the end of the commercial, he says, "Now that you know the truth, are you in good hands?" But beloved, that question itself is misleading, because the information delivered to the consumer in the course of the commercial doesn't change the consumer's coverage one bit. At the end of the commercial, you're still in the same hands you were in at the beginning of the commercial. And the knowledge of something that Allstate covers tells you nothing about what your current insurance covers. But the question, now that you know the truth, are you in good hands, is based on the erroneous implication that this new knowledge you've received is sufficient to help you evaluate your current coverage over against Allstate's coverage. Well, that's the same kind of error people make when evaluating the Monty Hall problem. And our tendency to make that kind of error helps to explain why human beings are so notoriously bad at playing games of chance. Because we tend to evaluate the odds not in the direct light of cold hard facts, but in the opaque light of human intuition. So with that in mind, why do you suppose God commended to us anything that even so much has the appearance of a game of chance when it comes to making decisions in the church? Because that's exactly what seems to be in view in Acts 1, 15 through 26, where we find the following. "In those days Peter stood up among the brothers. The company of persons was in all about 120, and said, 'Brothers, the scriptures had to be fulfilled which the Holy Spirit spoke beforehand by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus. For he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their own language Akeldama, that is, field of blood. For it is written in the book of Psalms, May his camp become desolate, and let there be no one to dwell in it, and let another take his office.' So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. And they put forward two, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, 'You, Lord, who knows the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place.' And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles." When Peter obeyed the word, as he understood it, and moved to fill the 12th apostolate, the means, in his estimation, by which the final choice of the candidates at hand should be made was by the casting of lots. And quite apparently, all the apostles were persuaded not only of the efficacy of this means of making that decision, but that the outcome of this sort of consultation of the Father should be genuinely reflective of his will in the matter. And there's no refutation of this anywhere in the Bible, and frankly, we shouldn't expect that there would be. After all, this form of decision-making was used a number of times in the Old Testament, and it was never part of the law. And as such, it falls into that category of things for which we seek command, example, or necessary inference in the New Testament in order for us to feel free to employ such things in the church. And as I understand the matter, the example given to us in Acts 1 gives us those very grounds. Now, there are those who would dispute this, arguing that the church didn't begin until the second chapter of Acts and the unfettered pouring out of the Spirit on flesh. But I don't think that disputation holds any water. No, the 3,000 who were baptized on the day of Pentecost were added to the church, which necessarily means that the 120 who occupied the upper room in Acts 1 were already the church. And as such, I don't see any way to exclude the casting of lots as non-covenantal under the New Testament. It's clearly covenantal in the New Testament church. The question is, why would God choose a game of chance as a means of decision-making among his people? And under what circumstances should anything like the casting of lots be employed in the church? And these are two questions on which the Bible is not silent. First, the Bible makes it clear that the casting of lots, as it is used in faith and practice among God's people, is not a game of chance. In Ecclesiastes 9:11, Solomon tells us, "I returned and saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but timing and chance betide them all." And this is a passage that requires thoughtful interpretation, because chance is a measure of the likelihood that a given event will occur, which likelihood is usually expressed as the ratio of favorable cases to the whole number of cases possible. So, for instance, in the case of tossing a coin, the likelihood of a given toss coming up heads is described as a 1 in 2 chance, or a 50-50 chance. But the way that people tend to talk about chance indicates a superstitious belief that there is a force, that there is an entity called chance that is operating on that coin to cause it to come up heads 50% of the time. So, for instance, if I were to flip a coin and it came up heads 6 times in a row, there are people who would bet money that the 7th toss would come up tails. That kind of reasoning has to do with the notion that the coin has been resisting the force of chance, or the power of chance, which force is ultimately irresistible. And the longer the coin resists the force of chance, the more that force will build up until eventually the coin will yield to the power of chance and will come up tails, just as chance dictates that it should. But that kind of thinking is nothing but a form of animism, a kind of magical thinking, because the truth of the matter is that the chances of any coin toss coming up heads is 50-50, and those odds don't dictate anything. They merely describe possibility and probability. And when it comes to truly random events, prior outcomes have no effect on future events, which is to say that the fact that the coin has come up heads 6 times in a row has no effect on the 7th coin toss. The odds of every coin toss is the same. Accordingly, in Ecclesiastes 9:11, Solomon, who is wise and should know this, cannot possibly be telling us that there's a hidden force called chance that sets skill and training and knowledge and planning at naught. And he doesn't seem to attribute the happenstance of unexpected outcomes to the direct providence of God. Rather, he's telling us that in spite of skill, training, knowledge, and planning, unlikely and unforeseen, and indeed unforeseeable outcomes often occur. And we've all seen that happen on numerous occasions. But when such things happen, we should take care, because it's one thing to say, what are the odds? But it's another thing entirely to say, well, that was just meant to be. Because whenever you say, well, that was meant to be, you had better be prepared to answer the question, meant by whom? Because according to Solomon, there's a degree of chance built into the warp and woof of the fabric of creation. God is sovereign over everything, but in his sovereignty, he chooses not to control everything. And according to Solomon, he doesn't give us control over everything either. No, some things are left to timing and chance. But make no mistake about it, timing and chance are not things, and they certainly do not have minds. they are not capable of forming intent. And the things that come about as a result of timing and chance are by no means meant to be. No, indeed, what Solomon is telling us in Ecclesiastes 9:11 is the opposite of that. Not everything happens for a reason. Some things just happen. And that is a state of affairs that has been ordained, or at least allowed, by God under the sun. Under the sun, timing and chance do, in fact, betide us all. But, also according to Solomon, one place where chance is not a factor is in the casting of lots. That's what he tells us in Proverbs 16:33, where he says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." According to the Bible, the casting of lots does not introduce chance into the decision-making process. It eliminates chance from the decision-making process. And 2 chapters later, Solomon tells us under what circumstances the casting of lots should be used. Because in Proverbs 18:18, he says, "To cast lots puts an end to disputes and decides between strong contenders." Now think that through, because the concept here is really important. In other lessons, I've demonstrated to you that the most difficult decisions we ever have to make are not decisions between good and evil, but decisions between good and good. It's been quite a while now since I attended a youth rally, but I sincerely doubt that they've changed much since I was a youth minister. I imagine that they're still presenting really badly written skits about peer pressure. Skits that do not approximate in any meaningful sense the way that peer pressure actually plays out. Because in such skits, evil is presented as obviously and blatantly evil. But frankly, anyone with anything like a moral compass and a spine shouldn't have any real difficulty discerning good from evil. I mean, I can't imagine having given in to blatant peer pressure, say to drink or to drink to excess, even when I was 15. Now, granted, alcohol has never been very alluring to me, but the temptation presented at youth rally skits isn't usually the specific temptation to drink or anything like that, but rather the temptation to compromise one's values for the sake of social acceptance. But even at that, I made it through high school without a drop of fire water and never lacked for friends or status. I'm not holding myself up as a paragon of virtue. I did lots of things in high school that you'll never hear about in a sermon. But they were all a whale of a lot more interesting, daring, and creative than anything that I ever saw in a skit at a youth rally. But those things were tempting to me not because they were evil, but because they carried with them a certain kind of infamy, a certain kind of legendary glory, or better yet, a certain kind of private glory, the self-satisfaction of getting away with something and never telling the tale, forever leaving everyone to wonder. And the reason I gave in to those temptations was because at the time I viewed that kind of legendary status as a good that was worth the risk of being caught. But blatant temptation is easy to resist when what is being proffered is obviously bad. So, for instance, when I was standing in the school parking lot one day and a kid that I had never seen before walked up and tried to sell me marijuana, I was thinking, first of all the dope dealers in school know that I don't use drugs. And second, while this guy doesn't actually have a wire coming out from the bottom of his pants leading to the suspiciously plain-looking panel van parked a few yards away, he's obviously a narcotics officer. So what could I say but, "No, officer"? But, beloved, that is not the kind of thing that's in view in Proverbs 18:18. No, according to that proverb, to cast lots puts an end to disputes and decides between strong contenders. And strong contenders aren't dissimilar to one another. Strong contenders are similar to one another. The casting of lots isn't for making decisions between good and evil. No, choices between good and evil are easy. The casting of lots is for making choices between good and good. And that concept is so clear in Proverbs 18:18 that even Eugene Peterson couldn't screw it up. As we read in The Message, you may have to draw straws when faced with a tough decision. Because tough decisions aren't decisions between things that are opposite to one another. Tough decisions are between things that are similar to one another. And every time we see the casting of lots used in the Bible, the choice that's being made is between things that are morally or ontologically or categorically similar or equal to one another. For example, in 1 Chronicles 24, David cast lots in order to set up a priestly rotation. And in that rotation, all the priests are fully and equally qualified to serve in the tabernacle or the temple. This was not a choice between good and evil. This was a choice between good and good. It was adiaphorous, holding no moral content whatsoever, except that the rotation should be fair and unbiased. And we find that 1,000 years after this system was put in place by David, it was still in place and working very nicely when the New Testament comes around. Luke 1, 8 through 9, Zechariah's division of the priesthood was on duty, and he was serving as priest before God when, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord to burn incense. In the same way, when Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and the city once again became habitable, those who would live in the holy city were chosen by the casting of lots. Nehemiah 11, 1 through 2. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in their other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. In this case, all the candidates for residency in the city of God were equally qualified. There was no way for men to choose without creating the appearance of bias or favoritism or nepotism or the like. So they let God decide. But they didn't set before God anyone who was not ethnically Hebrew. There were no Assyrians in the lot, no Philistines. No, they knew who was qualified to live in Jerusalem. They just didn't want to be responsible for choosing who would live there. So they let God choose. Likewise, as we read in Numbers 26, 52 through 56, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Among these the land shall be divided for inheritance according to the number of names. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance in proportion to its list, but the land shall be divided by lot. According to the names of the tribes and their fathers they shall inherit. Their inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller." And later on in the book of Joshua, we see that this is exactly how this was carried out. Again, this was not a choice between who would get land and who wouldn't. It was merely a choice between who would get which land. And again, lest there be a hint of bias, discrimination, favoritism, or nepotism, the decision was made by the casting of lots. Similarly, this is the way that the priests decided among themselves how to share the expense of providing the wood for all the offerings that would be brought to Jerusalem. As we read in Nehemiah 10:34, "We, the priests, the Levites, and the people have likewise cast lots for the wood offering, to bring it into the house of our God, according to our fathers' houses, at times appointed year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law." And we see the same kind of principle at play in other uses of the casting of lots. For instance, in regard to the offerings on the Day of Atonement, we find the following in Leviticus 16, 6 through 10. "Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, and it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. Again, this was not a choice between good and evil. No, the goat that was chosen as the victim for sin was going to die for the sins of the children of Israel. And the goat that was chosen as the scapegoat had to go to Azazel. Now, the Hebrew word Azazel in modern Hebrew means go to hell. And the scapegoat unto Azazel was to be led outside the camp to the Badlands, to the God-forsaken regions of the desert, and be left there to live with the guilt of the people on its head. And don't imagine for a minute that that translates into a wild goat frolicking about on the rocks having a jolly old time. No, this is a domesticated goat with no survival skills, which will almost certainly be killed and eaten by predators if it lives long enough to be killed and eaten. Because make no mistake about it, there's no way that any mortal creature could take on that kind of spiritual burden and live for very long. The transfer of sin guilt to both the victim for sin and the scapegoat was never symbolic, it was always actual. And you put that kind of spiritual burden on an animal the size of a goat and leave it to its own devices, and it'll be coughing up blood by sundown. But I digress. The point is that neither goat gets off scot-free. The casting of lots doesn't decide which will live and which will die. The casting of lots decide which one will die this morning under the watchful eyes of an onlooking crowd, and which one will die this evening cold and alone in the wilderness. And that's a rule of thumb on which you can rely. The casting of lots is not for deciding questions of good and evil. It's for deciding questions of good and good, or of evil and evil. It isn't a tool of first resort. It's for breaking ties between things that are morally, ontologically, or categorically similar or identical to one another. Now, if you know your Bible really well, and if you're on the ball this morning, you may at this point be asking in your head, but what about the episode of Achan and the plunder? Wasn't that a discernment of good and evil? Wasn't Achan identified as the perpetrator in that incident, and wasn't he identified by the casting of lots? Well, there are 2 ways, or at least 2 ways, to account for what is recorded in Joshua 7 in regard to Achan. First, it should be noted that there is no biblical evidence that the casting of lots was actually used in regard to Achan. In verse 14 of Joshua 7, it says, "In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought near by your tribes, and the tribe that the Lord takes by lot shall come near by the clans." However, in verse 14 of Joshua 7, there's actually no mention in the Hebrew of the means by which the Lord will take one tribe over another, or one family over another, or one man over another. No, a number of translators have intuited that the means by which the selection would have been done would have been by way of the casting of lots, but that information is actually absent from the Hebrew text. However, it could be that the wheedling that's described in Joshua 7 was conducted by the casting of lots, and if it were, then that could only mean one thing. At least as I understand the matter, it could mean only one thing. Because the casting of lots is not for discerning between good and evil, but between things that are morally, ontologically, or categorically the same or similar to one another. And with that in view, it seems likely to me that Achan was not the only one who kept part of the plunder for himself. No, as a matter of fact, given the base moral character of the children of Israel, it actually seems most likely to me that no matter which tribe to which the lot fell, no matter which clan, no matter which family, no matter which man, if they went to that guy's tent and looked under the rug, they would have found plunder there, as well. Achan just happened to be the one who had to pay the price, which price was unfair, but not unjust. Achan got exactly what he deserved for what he had done. But everyone else who had committed the same offense got off with a warning, with the example of Achan. Beloved, the casting of lots is not for discerning between good and evil, but between things that are morally, ontologically, or categorically the same or similar to one another. And that's exactly the situation that we find in Acts 1 with the appointment of Matthias to replace Judas as the 12th apostle. Because according to Acts 1, 21 through 22, Peter set the criterion for qualification for the position before the lots were cast. And both of the men who were on the ballot met the criterion. So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. And they put forward two, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. Beloved, the decision between Joseph Justus and Matthias was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between good and good. There was never any chance that the lot would fall on an unqualified candidate. Because the casting of lots isn't designed to introduce chance into the decision-making process of the church. The casting of lots is designed to eliminate chance from the process. That's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. We hope that you have found Dr. Becker's message well appointed. To hear more lessons like this one, visit our website at www.steamboatchurch.org or come see us at 1698 Lincoln Avenue in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Bible classes are Sunday mornings at 9:30 and worship services are at 10:30. We look forward to meeting you. Until then, may the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.